One of the really hard things about working in your silos is you can't get to this sweet spot of what is desirable for our users, what's feasible from an engineering perspective, or what's available to us in terms of technology, and what's profitable for the company, which I'm sure you're all familiar with this kind of diagram. It's like the foundation of a lot of design thinking. But for us, getting to this sweet spot, involves working collaboratively, cross-functionally. And I was lucky enough in 2013 to participate in what was our first innovation week for the ads and commerce team. And we were starting to try out some of these design sprint methods to help us get to this sweet spot in the middle. And that framework, the design sprint framework, really helped us to break down these silos and unlock that magic that happens when you bring the three perspectives together. This structured framework, as I'm sure many of you are all very familiar, but really helped us to gain buy-in for ideas with these cross-functional partners, with our product managers, to create more implementable solutions, which I think was one of the early benefits and wins for us, which was we could really bring the engineering perspective with the UX perspective, and then allow us to better leverage our research, our data, and to understand what was technologically possible. So getting to that stage of cross-functional collaboration was really a big breakthrough for me in my career, helped me to move forward and have more impact as a visual designer. So you're all probably thinking, how does cross-functional collaboration relate to this idea of being future ready? One of the things that I'm looking at right now is the future of work, which I'm sure many of you are all exploring. What does the future of work look like? But being future ready isn't really just having a magic crystal ball to see what's coming. We all probably wish we had one earlier this year, but unfortunately that's not really an option. And so part of what we're looking at and building an understanding of is being future ready as a way of being, which means really working within a complex adaptive system. We are in complex systems every day, but how can we be adaptive to what's coming? A good example, and this is probably a pretty common one, is the beehive, which is a living system, and the bees are all working towards a common goal, appears to be a common goal, but the queen bee is not giving the hive specific directions. They're just operating based on their DNA programming and the stimulus response that they have to what's happening around them, and this allows them to adapt and move as a unit. So what we want to do, and what we've been looking at, is how do we build this DNA into our teams and into our culture, so that the individuals within an organization are able to make their own choices on a daily basis, but this moves all of us together to adapt quickly. So I like to think about this as, really building teams that are adaptable and agile and able to pivot quickly as needed. This is like a mindset and something that we have to build as a muscle. And we have to have a safe environment to work in, where you can experiment and be resilient, so that when those experiments fail, you're able to pick yourself back up and keep going. And inherent in all of this is understanding how complex systems work and navigating complexity. So we like to train people in understanding how systems work and adopting systems thinking. And really, ultimately, this is about building a learning organization, which is not a new concept. Peter Senge popularized the concept in his book, The Fifth Discipline, way back in 1990. So these are characteristics of a learning organization: having systems thinking, personal mastery, building mental models that you can use to make decisions, having that shared vision, and then learning as you go. And one of the things that we've found is that our Sprint Academy that we've been running for 5 years actually helps us to build these things and helps us to be a learning organization. At the individual level, we build the mastery of these leaders and facilitators. And then the work that they're doing on a regular cadence, on a weekly cadence or a monthly cadence, is helping to infuse this mindset into the product development process and move forward our culture, the culture of our organization. So this has had to shift pretty quickly this year. And when we were all asked to work from home back in March, we had a lot of critical design sprints in flight, you could say, that had to be pivoted to a remote format. I was one of those people who said, I'd done it myself, but I said, oh, it's not really worth it. It's so hard to do, and you lose all of these great benefits when you get people in a room together. So we hadn't heavily invested in it as a way of working remotely. Somebody had mentioned before, oh, how is Google, a global company, not collaborating remotely? We have lots of remote collaboration tools, but when it comes to the structured, accelerated collaboration in person, for design sprints, we really relied heavily on bringing people together in person. So this was a new skill. We had pretty deep mastery in the design sprint methodology. As Dan mentioned earlier, we've trained thousands of UXers, and we have a very engaged community of 400 sprint leaders that are able to raise their hand at any point in time and run a sprint within the company. But we really didn't have a lot of remote sprinting expertise. So this was one of those moments where we had to say, okay, how are we going to build this skill very quickly and scale it across the organization? So the first thing that we did was just host a brown bag and bring together the people that were doing the remote sprints and have them share their tools for it, their tips and tricks, and help people to learn from them. And this very quickly became a weekly share out, where each week we'd have people come and share their learnings from whatever they had tried most recently. So we were building an understanding of how we could make it work with our tools and scaling and sharing that success as it was being developed. We did learn very quickly that an in-person sprint, a full 3 days, we couldn't just spread those hours, as I'm sure all of you guys have learned working remotely. We can't expect people to stay on a video conference for 8 hours a day. It's just not humanly possible. So we started looking at what does a virtual format really look like? How do we accommodate, video conference fatigue? And we really can't transcend space and time. While we can be here together right now, I can't stay up all night in order to collaborate with Sydney. I have family, I have things going on, or Australia. So we had to look at how do we spread it across time in a way that accommodates all of our different time zones. And we did learn that it was about more than just distributing the hours and saying we need 8 hours spread out across a week. We were experiencing time in different ways based on what was happening across the world in different people's lives. And everything in the digital environment seemed to be taking more time. So we had less of it and it was harder to get things done. So we had to really think about, what is a design sprint? What is this thing that we're doing? How are we going to get the outcomes that we want to get with this methodology within these new constraints? So one of the things that we recognized in this time was that the design sprint brand had afforded us a lot. It really became this container and this calling card that would allow us to get the engineers and product managers to come do UX accelerated collaboration with us. So that was really working in our favor. But in a lot of ways, we were just using it as a container. Once we got people into the room, we could figure out what needed to happen. You know, sometimes it's a little messy once you get folks, you know, in a room and you start pulling apart the problem and figuring out who are the real users. And we would do a lot of problem framing in advance and research, but very often we would just lean into the process. And we didn't have the luxury to do this anymore, because when you have less time and you're asking people, you know, to come and dedicate synchronous time together when our synchronous time is really different, we had to think much more carefully about our goals. So I like to say that we kind of atomized the sprint, where we looked at what are the components within the sprint? What are the things that we're doing to achieve the bigger goal? And how can we pull out those elements and engage in those elements to get the outcomes that we're looking for? So one of the things we had to start doing was really focus on the goals for each session, whether it's a sprint or some kind of a design thinking workshop. We had to look at, what does this product team need to take on right now? And what are ways which we can break down that bigger goal into smaller sessions? We also had to get the tech and the tools right, and build confidence with our facilitators in these tools. We found that based on the all kinds of different audiences. Though we were very excited to have Mural available to us and to get that onboarded, we also found that there are situations when we had to use other tools. So really understanding what were the tools based on the audience. And designing for energy, engagement, and connection. And I'm sure many of you have struggled with this as well. There are so many soft benefits, we say, with design sprints, where you get people in a room together and they benefit from developing shared knowledge and shared understanding of their roles. So how do you design for that in a session like this, where I can't see all of your faces? You're probably doing other things, you're multitasking. So we're not getting that connection that we might get when we all get together. And your energy is going to be different when, you know, you're in your own space at your own time zone. So we really looked at ways of doing that and built new toolkits for that. So some examples that I like to share to give you, you know, an understanding of how we were able to pivot. The Cloud UX team, one example, used basic empathy mapping to identify opportunities for better meeting their customers' needs. So they said, okay, right now, we really just need to identify some opportunities and get a better understanding of our users. That might be a method you would put in a larger sprint, but here we can get to what is the thing we need to do right now. The Google Health team wanted to define the critical user journeys for their offering. So they were looking at, can we just use our critical user journey method? You might incorporate that at the beginning of a sprint to help you identify where to focus your sprint. But in the context of less time, they knew they needed to start with this step. Assumption mapping is a great tool. David Bland has, from Precoil, we have that on our website and we use that often. The Google for Education team use that in a remote session to help find the gaps and what were the unknowns for the product team. And then we had our emerging markets team working across time zones and countries to set longer term visions and roadmaps over multiple days with multiple teams. And they really looked at, what do we need to do synchronously, and what can we do in between and then asynchronously. And then even some of these things like helping a new team form a shared mission or vision. I ran one of these with our new team that had formed around, using something like the Golden Circle from Simon Sinek and helping you get to, really the what, the why, and the how. So we were able to keep our team sprinting. Over 60% of our UXers participating in a sprint during the 4 or 5 month time period. And that was a pretty big accomplishment given how much we all felt like we had to put the brakes on everything. And we were able to actually find some benefits. And I'll be curious to hear from some of you later. The remote context can often solve some of the other problems that we've experienced in the methodology. The one that we hear a lot is that, well, the sprint documents itself because everything is digital as you're going through it. And that was a huge pain point for a lot of our sprint facilitators. It can sometimes create more space for quieter voices, so it can be a little bit more inclusive. And we did find that, or we are finding still, that our engineering and product partners see it as a different activity that's a break from their 30-minute meetings that they're in all day. And so in some ways, we were getting more engagement than we have in the past. And we've even used it in the outside of Google. One of the things that Googlers do a lot of is working with the external community. And we ran remote sprints with the California Public Schools to help them get back to school faster, with the New York City nonprofit programs to help folks who wanted to get support, COVID support, and even our equitable health programs. So we've been able to leverage it in our outside of Google as well.